Welcome to this overview of threats and pressures in Irish habitats and species. And I want to start off by giving you an insight into the overall status, and this is usually assessed by the EPA. They do a State of the Environment report every 4 years. The last one you can see here was in 2020, so we're due one next year. They take various aspects of the Irish environment, so water, land use, nature, etc. And they give an overview of the current trends and status in it. And then they come with this summary information. So what is the outlook for what they've assessed? And in the nature section here, you can see we've got EU habitats, we've got birds, we've got butterflies. So those are indicators that we look at to tell us about the state of environment or nature. And you can see the outlook is red dot with a downward pointing arrow, which means that the outlook isn't favourable. And here on the other side, on current assessment, you can see that at the moment, only habitats have a red current assessment. So much of the habitats that are important at European level are in a bit of trouble. The others, there's signs or indicators that they're in trouble, and you can read in the notes why. So that gives us an understanding that there's pressures and threats happening to even the most important indicators that we could look at in our environment to tell us about the state of it. I'm going to concentrate on the EU habitats and species because we're supposed to be looking after those. They are designated species and habitats, and there's money and effort and time spent towards trying to bring those back into something called favourable conservation status. And if that's not happening, what are the main pressures and threats to that? An overview of the Birds and Habitats Directive is just really useful starting point to think about. So the Birds Directive was actually the first one that came into being as a piece of European biodiversity legislation. 2009 there is the update of it. But at the time they were worried about lots of different bird species. Bird species don't recognise boundaries, of course, so they were going across different European nations. And trying to get together some sort of cohesive network of protected sites so that bird species that were vulnerable to problems, so Annex 1 species, that they would be given some level of protection. And that came about then in the special protection areas. On the other side then, in 1992, this piece of legislation called the Habitats Directive came into force. And that had a list of Annex 1 habitats, so habitats that are really important at European level, Annex 2 species that are really important at European level. And for those, special areas of conservation had to be designated. There are a number of other species as well that fall under Annex 4. So Annex 4 species are species that have to be protected wherever they occur. For example, bats. It doesn't matter whether they're inside a designated area or outside it, they have to be protected. And Annex 5 species are species where they might have been taken in the past for commercial gain, etc. And now there's a kind of a stop gap on that as part of the legislation. On the left-hand side, you can see some of the habitats that we have in the EU Habitats Directive that are found in Ireland. Limestone pavement, active blanket bog, they both have an asterisk beside them because they're priority habitats. So all of the listed habitats are really important, but the ones that are really, really important are called priority habitats. So we're meant to spend more time and effort making sure that they're in good condition. On the bottom there, you can see acid grassland and Molinia meadow. Molinia meadow, of course, being quite wet, damp grassland, acid upland grassland that can often be sheep grazed. So there's different management associated with each of these habitats. On the right-hand side then, what you can see are examples of the habitats species that are listed. Marsh saxifrage is only found in a few locations in bogland. Marsh fritillary is more widespread. It's our only protected butterfly species. Right next to that, you have the vertigo snails, so very small, tiny snails, no more than 2 millimeters really in size, and they're indicators of damp or flush vegetation. And above that, you have the freshwater pearl mussel. And freshwater pearl mussel is only found in the most pristine rivers that are Q4 or Q5, and they need the highest quality water that they can get. So managing habitats and managing population outcomes for these species is the subject of lots of work from the National Parks and Wildlife Service. And the goal of the Habitats Directive is to keep those habitats and species in favourable conservation status. What does that mean? So it means maintaining what you have, restoring if you need to, and enhancing wherever possible. For habitats, there's three main things that are looked at. There's what's called area and range. So range is the area or the extent over Ireland where you could expect to find this, and it's done in grid squares. Within that, then, you assess how much actual area you have of that particular habitat. So, for example, how much area you have in Malinia Meadow. Then you're going to look at the typical species. What species typically could you expect to find in this habitat, and are they there? And you can see there the purple head of the meadow thistle, and you might be able to just make out in the background a kind of white orchid. Those are typical species of this type of habitat, and you might realise that some of those are listed also in the acre scoring system. On the right hand side then we have freshwater pearl mussel acting as an example of the Annex 2 species. And if you're looking at those, then you're looking at population. What's the population like? What's the range? Would I expect to find them where they were in the past? And is the habitat that supports them in good condition? And I forgot to tell you what structure and function is in habitats. So structure and function is all the processes that a habitat needs to be able to go through in order to exist. So you can imagine in peatlands you need the structure and integrity. So in other words, no drainage to be a feature of that to make sure that the typical species would be able to be found there. And we are actually obligated to every 6 years produce a report and reporting on how we're getting on with favourable conservation status of those habitats and species. I've taken two examples from the National Parks and Wildlife website. I've taken the example of the grassland survey that went on for quite a few years because we lacked basic information on semi-natural grasslands in Ireland. And I've got an example there of monitoring for species that was done. All of this information is available on the National Parks and Wildlife Service. They've got a really good publication section. It's very detailed, in-depth information. And what that has to be done is distilled down into information that can be made publicly available so everybody can see how we're getting on with this process. And the way that that's done is you have this almost like a traffic light system. So if a species or a habitat is in favourable conservation, all of those attributes that I've just showed you need to be in favourable conservation status. If one or more of those is unfavourable, inadequate, but not bad, then it gets an unfavourable, inadequate status. If one of the attributes is considered to be in bad condition, and there's a way that you assess this, then the whole outlook for that species is considered to be unfavourable. So just to give you an example, this is hay meadow. I took that picture in a hay meadow in County Leitrim, South County Leitrim. There's a lot of information that goes on behind the scenes, a lot of information gathering and collecting, surveying, reporting, etc. That's all gathered together in a report. Again, it's freely available on the National Parks and Wildlife website. And this is the Annex 17 reporting. And as part of that reporting, there will have been surveys, up-to-date information gathered. So, for example, for hay meadows, plots would have been taken on hay meadows. So you go and you put down a square plot of a certain size, and you would assess what indicator species are present and other attributes as well, such as any threats, any damaging activities, any erosion of soil, things that should be sounding familiar from the acres scorecards. Here, for example, there's high quality indicators and positive indicators. The list of species, you will find some of these are replicated in the acre scoring system. For example, there, Leucanthemum vulgare is oxeye daisy, and it's readily, easily identifiable. Other indicators, such as meadowgrass there, Trisetum flavescens, it's not so easy for people to distinguish on the ground. So that's left to, I suppose, specialist botanists to assess every 6 years. And we can use other species, the acre scoring species, to help us assess more rapidly the quality that we're looking at in grasslands. So threats, what are the main threats? So when you go through the reporting, there's three main threats that come out for grassland. Undergrazing actually is one of the biggest issues perhaps in the northwest and along that western seaboard in high nature value farming systems, where it's uneconomically viable to continue grazing, say for example, very wet land. or land that's quite a distance from other greener land, that land may be left and abandoned, and then natural succession takes place, and it starts, woodland and scrub species start encroaching. In the middle there, afforestation. I took that picture when I was looking for grasslands to assess as part of the results-based pilot that we were doing in Leitrim from 2015 to 2018. And I was specifically looking for grassland that had held marsh fritillary. So marsh fritillary being an umbrella species, and it's associated with quite species-rich grasslands, like the Millennium Meadows. And when I spoke to the landowner, they told me that it was, again, economically unviable for them to continue farming that land because they had low stocking levels on it. And at the time, they considered that it was better for them financially to move to afforestation. And I just took a picture of the forested, what was once marsh fritillary grassland. On the right-hand side, then, we can see agriculture intensification. So where to make, I suppose, more economically viable prospect, there's a greater fertilisation input, or perhaps ploughing and reseeding. And this picture here I took at the edge of that haymeadow picture that I've been showing you throughout here. So most of the indicator species were still present in the haymeadow, but on the verges there was a threat or a sign that something was going to happen to that haymeadow over the future. There was supplementary feeding, and some of the perennial ryegrass that was coming in as seed in the supplementary feeding was now starting to occur in the haymeadow. And this is the example of reporting that the National Parks and Wildlife do for every one of those species and habitats that's listed. So the lowland haymeadow, there's a nice summary there of what it is. Then you have a list of the species that are found in it, and here underneath you have an indication of some of the factors that are impacting it. And you can see that overall the status is red, it's declining, it's bad, and the main aspect or the main threat there is fertilisation and agricultural intensification. And you can see, unfortunately, this sorry sight for peatland. So peatlands, extremely important. Remember, some, like active blanket bog, are priority habitats. And few main threats. Drainage, of course, been one of the major threats. As soon as you drain a peatland, you're changing the structure and function of that peatland. It isn't going to be able to support the species that it once did. An invasive species, so rhododendron being a huge issue on lots of different heathlands and peatlands. And indeed, the Pearl Mussel Project have been working with farmers in Connemara to try and get a locally led scheme to remove and deal with rhododendron threat to the habitats down there. Other peatland issues or threats are cutting or turbary. This particular picture on the left-hand side is from the Pearl Mussel Project website, and it's the Owen Riff, I believe, and you can see turbary right up or close to the edge of the river where there's freshwater pearl mussel. And turbary, of course, again, it's cutting, so as soon as you remove peat and change the drainage system, you're changing the types of species that can occur on top of the peatland. On the right-hand side, I took this picture in Commonage in the Bunduraha, which is one of the catchments for the pearl mussel. And this Commonage was very overgrazed, and you can see most of the peatland species had disappeared, and you're just left with peat hags and lots of bare ground, which is subject to potential erosion. Equally, undergrazing is also a feature in some peatlands. I say current threats to woodland in this line because most of the woodland has already, native woodland in Ireland has disappeared. We're left with small remnants. Only 20% of the woodland area in Ireland is actually semi-natural with deciduous trees. On the right-hand side there you can see again the threat of invasive species. So laurel, rhododendron, those are two of the major threats to, say, Killarney oak woods. And on the left-hand side there you can see, again, actually non-native sika roe deer grazing or browsing by deer on trees is impacting on native woodlands. So bringing all of that information together, a lot of the habitats and species, particularly habitats I should say, that are listed for Ireland are in bad conditions. So you can see some of the major ones here, like 2 grassland examples, active blanket bog, active raised bog, freshwater pearl mussel, old oak woodland, they're all considered to be overall in bad condition with an unfavourable outlook. I put in Marsh Tiller there as an example just to show you that it's not always, I suppose, bad news. Here in Marsh Tillery, the information is indicating that it has spread to areas where it wasn't found before, and there's been intensive recording and information gathering on that. That's why it's regarded as inadequate at the moment. There'll be further steps and surveys done over the next 6 years to see how that population is doing. So overall, what are we looking at in terms of these habitats and species? So habitat status there is whether it's favourable, inadequate or bad. And you can see that overall for all of the habitats and species, for all the habitats that we have in Ireland that are listed on the EU Habitats Directive, 40% nearly are in bad condition, 46% inadequate, and we only have 15% in good condition. Those tend to be kind of sea ones associated with the sea. Habitat trends, it's nearly 50-50 in terms of stable and declining, with a very small sliver that are improving. So remember, one of the goals is to restore as well, so we should be eating into that red chunk as we do work to restore habitats. On the bottom there you can see species, the same situation. More species are in favourable condition. Again, there's a lot of marine species as well listed there. So the ones that are associated with agriculture tend to be in the red or the orange block there. And species trends, again, relatively similar outlook there. Most are staying static wherever they were on that list. And then at the end of the EPA State of the Environment Address, they give you an indication of what are the main threats to habitats and species. This is for the nature section. And you can see there, agriculture stands out in terms of 70% of habitats are impacted by agricultural activities. Forestry, extraction resources, and alien species all standing out. So this is just giving you an insight into some of the pressures and threats. Of course, climate change is going to become an added factor into all of these issues and all of these threats, and it can have cumulative impacts on species and habitats that we can't even foretell at the moment. So I hope you've got some more insight into that.